I mean, it's the most important thing, you know. I think back to, for whatever reason, like Pete Levesque, my first teacher, that sound kind of just blew my mind. And then Pete had a good, you know, he's a jazz player, but had a good sort of classical foundation too. We were doing long tones and overtones really early on. And also my other teacher, Peter Tileston, who was the band director, this is random, but when I was in 7th grade, like the spring of my 7th grade year, I joined the high school marching band. They would like open it to the middle school kids. And, you know, spring rehearsals would start for the following fall. And some of those rehearsals, you know, it's hard for like students now to believe this, but they'd be twice a week, 3 hours long, 3 to 6. And rehearsals would often not make it past long tones and slow chorales. And so somehow like really early on sound was, and I certainly, that's when I sort of awakened a little bit as a saxophonist, because I certainly would not have had the horn in my mouth on my own that long.
Get twice a week?
Twice a week, 3 hours, yeah. And then as the season progressed, you know, you rehearse all summer. I think they were maybe once a week all summer. But then that marching band program was, you know, it's one of those real like drum corps style things.
Time, yeah.
I mean, they would get to 4 times a week for 3 hours, and then 4 hours on Saturdays. So.
Well, no wonder they have such a good band program.
Exactly,
you know?
Yeah. So, and then along the way in there, I randomly bought a Liebman book about his experience studying with Joe Allard, and that sort of supported what I was doing with Pete, where it got me, I just got really into doing long tones and overtones. And then when like Desmond became my ideal sound, and really early on Jimmy Giuffre, I seemed to like gravitate towards these like foofier players, what I call foofy. You know, I remember being into Ben Webster when I was in high school too. And, you know, Konitz, his sound changed and morphed as the years progressed, but certainly like the earlier stuff was at first what I really gravitated towards, the more airy sound. How did I get here? You know, it's always been an obsession, and then that's also why I connected with Garzone. You know, person after person was talking about sound first, you know, and I remember hearing at one point that like Clark Terry, probably through McNeil, would say sound, then time, then idea. And when I think of players, I always think of Cannonball as like the perfect example of that. But there's so many, you know. But like Cannonball, when you like transcribe what he's doing, sometimes it's weird notes, you know. Or I think about there's that famous Paul Gonsalves solo on Ellington.
Oh yeah,
27.
Starts in a wrong key. Right?
Yeah, and it's like that's another perfect example of like sound, time, then ideas. You can get away with anything. And Garzone was this huge beacon of like, and he'd be all in his Boston blue collar way, you know what I mean, like. Any note, any time, you know what I mean? And it's like, well, when you have his sound and his time, you can play anything, you know, and that guy was on wedding dates and then playing the freest of free jazz, and everyone loves it. I mean, I don't have any unique magic formula besides, I think when it comes to overtone series, overtone matching was always really important to me, like, you know, matching a middle C to a overtone C. I don't have anything like drastically, any like magic bullet to it, you know, besides like, you know.
What do you work on?
Like, I mean, organizing long tones, overtone matching. That Liebman book got into the overtone series and matching, and also into, which I think Lacey maybe talks about later too, where he would kind of bend what he calls the Ain't She Sweet exercise, which is like, you pick a note. So going through the entire horn, like, you know, ain't she sweet, being able to go down 2 half steps on every note, but do the entire range of the horn. And I remember connecting that to something Liebman said, like most people's embouchures are too tight. So like a lot of times it's when you're bent down that much, that's probably more where your embouchure should kind of be normally. So that doing that exercise can be really helpful. You know, Garzone talks a lot just about how open the throat needs to be to get that sort of hollower sound. It's always been like, for me on alto, getting the most tenory, unless I'm talking about Lee or maybe to me, the ultimate alto sound, and this is probably the most obvious thing in the world, is Bird on Just Friends. I mean, like, let's just pick the most, you know, the greatest to ever do it. You know? I would say that is my ideal sound by far. You know what I mean? A close second is most Paul Desmond records and and Lee Konitz, particularly in certain periods of his life. I was saying to you yesterday, if I could sound like Giuffre's clarinet sound on the alto, that would be something to shoot for. I've always chosen these impossible models because then the other thing is I'm always looking to tenor players. It's always Stan Getz and Garzone and Joe Henderson, you name it, 50s Sonny, that furriness around the sound. Yeah. Dark. Open. Yeah. In terms of the character of the upper register, Bird figured it out on that record where he's got the best upper register alto sound ever.
Yeah.
If an alto player is not my favorite, it usually has to do with their upper register. This thin alto-y thing.
Yeah, it's super hard to play.
It is.
In tune in the upper register without it sounding kind of whiny.
Yeah. And I know we've talked about this over the years, but that did lead to some equipment choices for me in recent years.
Yeah. What's happening?
The short story is you started on a Meyer 5 like everybody, after my Yamaha 4C or whatever. And then in college along the way, I shifted to a Selmer S80F, which was a dark classical mouthpieces. It bought it new, from the 90s.
Oh, but
not a
S80F, not a C-star.
Not a C-star,
right.
Exactly. So it was a more open classical mouthpiece with a really flat baffle.
That's an interesting...
No one told me to get it. I don't know why. You know what? Actually, Matina Roberts may have told me to get it.
Really?
Or maybe I noticed she was playing something like that.
Oh,
she was a grad student when I was an undergrad. I learned so much just from hanging from her. She, she just felt like this real musician, that was only a little older. I mean, she's astounding. I love her. Or you know what it was also? Maybe I heard in my ignorance that Kenny Garrett played a Selmer mouthpiece, but I didn't know what a soloist was. Yeah, and so I walked in the shop and said, oh, I want a Selmer. You know what I mean? Something like that. Maybe that's a soloist. I don't know. It was pre-internet. You didn't know anything,
Yeah.
So that may have been part of it too, because I was really into triology, And then only a couple years later, I knew Garzone, and I always go back to these two guys, but I knew they were playing a metal G on soprano, and I loved their soprano sounds. I got that on soprano, and it just worked. I was way into it. So then I got one of those for alto, a metal. So it's the Selmer classic metal G. Again, a modern mouthpiece at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what in there I switched from my Yanagisawa to a Super 20.
A King Super 20.
Yeah. And there I stayed for 15 years.
I don't think I knew you, but I knew your first album. Some point along the way, I learned you played a King Super 20, and I was like, what? I just couldn't believe, because in my brain, King Super 20 is Cannonball Adderley sound.
Right, sure, yeah. But it's also Gigi Grice, which is not so far away from the concept that I'm going for.
No.
And it's also Bird with strings, although I didn't know I was playing a totally different Super 20 than Bird was playing. I was playing a later one that is brighter and, when you start getting into the weeds of serial numbers and stuff, it was a pretty different horn that I was playing. Mm-hmm. But I think part of me, again, in my ignorance was oh, I got this metal mouthpiece in a Super 20, the pictures of Bird on, with Mitch Miller on those records or whatever.
Okay, all right.
And so it made sense on some level. Mm-hmm. And I, for 15 years, again, I think what I realized is, at a certain volume level, I really liked that sound. I always had sort of intonation problems that I struggled with, but I liked that sound at a certain level. And I understand physically now why that was working. And then basically what happened is I dropped my horn about 5-6 years ago. Classic didn't zip my BAM case, swung it over my shoulder, and just slow motion watched my saxophone fly out onto
This is the King?
This was the King Super 20. And I had taken pride on being a one horn, one mouthpiece dude, not an equipment guy, I also kind of took pride in not being a Selmer guy, I don't know, it was punk rock aesthetic or whatever it is, but oh cool, I'm doing this, everyone else is doing that. And I had no backup horn. I was, this is not the guy because now you know me as this horn nerd who has all these axes. I had no backup mouthpiece, nothing. Luckily my mouthpiece didn't break. But the guy who worked where I was teaching, Alden Banta, who we both know, had a backup horn that he was very kind to let me borrow. And it was actually one of these. It was a cigar cutter, not a radio. I blew into it, and it was like, oh, this is way better than my horn. So it was like this weird, like, but it was like I had no experience on another horn. And I remember once in a while I'd blow into someone else's horn, and I just wouldn't like it. I always was, because I grew on that King. That's where I like learned freaking approach tones, and you know what I mean? I was like terrible, and then learned things on the King. And so years went by where I was really messing around with horns and really messing around with mouthpieces. And a pivotal mouthpiece moment, because what I was finding, and I remember we were talking about this, was I like the sound at a certain volume, but when I add air to it, it brightens up. Now, a lot of people want that and like that, and I totally get why they want that, and it allows for flexibility, and it allows you to play in different situations. Just aesthetically, it's just not what I wanted, and I was envious of tenor players who's like Lavano, obviously, or Getz, who seems to be able to, with a dark sound, it's still big. And I remember reading a Getz interview when I was in high school in Saxophone Journal, where he said, I find that with my dark sound, if I like envision the back of the room, I can fill it up, as opposed to like a bright sound that is a laser. And both are fine, both are correct or whatever, but that was his. And so I remember like envisioning that. Is it possible to have a big dark sound on the saxophone, on the alto in particular, that carries? And Bird certainly sounds like he's doing that to me. And I've heard accounts of his sound being huge. Who knows how much he was hugging the mic on that strings record or whatever it was. Maybe he was just playing softer. It was with strings, I don't know. So this led to me starting to mess with mouthpieces. And a pivotal moment for that was Eric Greifenhagen, the guy who is the head mouthpiece guy at Morgan. Basically, I called Morgan, and he was so generous. And in this like 1 hour conversation, it was probably 4 years ago now, I learned everything I know about mouthpieces. I knew nothing about mouthpieces, and then he just was so generous with his time. And
mouthpieces.
Yeah, and he, I know things about mouthpieces, and he, it was in that conversation that he pointed out, well, if you want to push and you don't want the sound to brighten up, you need a large chamber mouthpiece. He also pointed out the fact that the original Adolph Sax design, if you look at the graphics or the drawings, the patent, the original design is for a large chamber mouthpiece. He also pointed out that the big American horns, like the Kings and the Khans that I like playing, are actually designed to be played with a large chamber mouthpiece. And he was so cool that he didn't say, oh, buy this Morgan that I work for. He said, what I would do, he pointed me in the direction of 20s mouthpieces like Bisher, Selmer Airflow, Early Lynx, even some Bundys and Woodwind Company. And me being obsessive at that time, I bought all of them. And then I started sending him mouthpieces.
To open them up.
Because those tip sizes were so small. And so they were large chamber mouthpieces, and then I would get them opened and keep the baffle flat. I started thinking of it like, I don't pay for lessons anymore. Every time I do this, I learn about sound. So that's what helped me sleep at night. And I was
hey, whatever helps you sleep.
Exactly. Yeah, and
yeah.
So anyway, long story long, the chambers were getting bigger, the tips were getting bigger, and I started realizing I'm sort of in tenor range here. And I started actually looking at the chambers. Like I have a Master Link alto piece. That chamber is bigger than any tenor mouthpiece I own. So there's no like standard for chamber size. You know what I mean? Some of them are drastically bigger than others. And then my friend Harry Paz, who's a great tenor player who lives in town, we do gigs together once in a while, started playing a Barry mouthpiece on tenor. That got my gears turning. And then Billy Drews, sort of famously among people like us, we know plays a tenor. He actually plays his very tenor mouthpiece on his alto. And I've always loved his sound. And I had never met him, and I finally met him through Adam Kolker and saw him play, and we got into a quick conversation about it. He couldn't have been nicer. And he was very humble and jovial about it. And yeah, I just slap it on and it works, and that was the moment where I was like, okay, I'm going to try this. So because I was already at tenor tip sizes and noticing that the chambers I was playing were tenor sized. So I was like, why not just give it a shot? And so that's kind of where I've arrived in the last year, where like I'm kind of waffling between two mouthpieces. One Eric did. Eric hipped me to these old Bundy mouthpieces which you have one on tenor too, and it's amazing. I play one on tenor, and so I have one of those that I do on alto as well, and then this is actually a Van Doren. And my dad, who's just good with tools, cut the shank off. I find with the Robner ligature, it hides it a little bit. You know what I mean? If you're like,
cool. You
notice, but on any gig, like a non-saxophonist, they have no idea. Like this is a tenor 8-star, and it's a 4.5 reed.
Wow.
You would think it's impossible.
A Rico 4.5?
It's a Francois Louis, so it's like a Regati.
Okay.
And the way I think about it is, if I were to put this on a tenor, it would be really hard to blow into. But what I'm playing here is the upper register of a tenor. That's how I started thinking about it. Is like, I want Stan Getz's upper register through my alto. Cool. You know what I mean? Sorry.
Interesting way to think about it.
And so like, if I were to put this setup on a tenor, my low register would not speak. It'd be really tough, but I don't need it. You know what I mean? I only need to go down to an E flat on tenor because I'm holding an alto, so it's my low B flat. So for whatever reason, it feels free blowing. It works. I'm not like struggling. It doesn't, despite it being maybe considered a large tip and a hard reed. It doesn't. I'm not in pain playing it.
That's interesting.
And it's working for me.
You sound amazing on it. So
I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
The one other thing about the large chamber that I heard along the way is. And Eric hit me to this, was like the intonation thing. My intonation, I still am as insecure as anybody about intonation, but my intonation got a lot better when I made that switch away from the little Selmer mouthpieces. And he pointed out, those soloists are made for a 6. That's a horn that plays more in tune. He's like, you're playing these old Kings and Khans and like the earlier Selmers. They're actually designed for a bigger chamber. But a horn that's like from the 50s on, those came with a soloist. You have more options with those horns, basically. Like you can make a bigger chamber, or but to put not that there aren't examples of it. I think Gigi Grice again played one of those metal Selmers on a King. So obviously people can do it. Anyone can do anything, in the right hands. But it was an adjustment, because I think intonation started being more about my throat and the cavity, within my mouth than
here.
Jaw pressure or this.
What does writing and recording music mean to you?
That has changed as the years have passed. Like when I think back to my first record, it was about composing more seriously, and then when I felt like I had enough tunes and something to say, it just felt like the right time. And it's funny because at the time I thought it was late, but it was, I was 25 or something. You know what I mean? It was fine. It was a perfectly good time, early for some, late for others, whatever. So I think our generation, we didn't have the luxury of like A&R people and us being able to sit in a bubble and create, and then let a publicist and a machine put our music out into the world. And so like the struggle is like mixing business with pleasure, or and so that evolved over the years, because what happened is I made that first record, got a relationship with Jordi Pujol at Fresh Sound, who I adore. I'm still grateful to him for that opportunity, and I know he's helped you as well, and make wonderful records. And the second record, which was Plainville, which is like become a project for me, was when I more deeply started reconciling my background as just like a non-jazz kid, a Beatles fan, a kid who was in rock bands, who listened to the Pixies and stuff like that, and how can I bring those influences in? And I probably started gaining confidence as a composer, and was interested in having like a working band, and
in this Plainville was that band?
That was that band for 2 records, with Pete Rendy and Brandon Seabrook, and R.J. Miller and Ivan Opsvik. And yeah, that music felt super personal to me because it felt, Plainville's the town I'm from. It couldn't be less of a jazz place. And, but it felt like I was reflecting on what had happened up until then and like owning my background more as opposed to like hiding. Like my first record, I listened to it with, I'm proud of it. But to me, it's me making a fresh sound record. I knew I was like me sounding like a fresh sound record that I was influenced by or something, And I'm proud I just got all that together because when I look at 25-year-old me, I was kind of an idiot, So I was just young and foolish, whatever, So and so it's evolved as the years, as the records came, as I grow up as a human, and it waffles between the kind of like there is no why, why do we do this at all, because no one's asking us to do this anymore. I think when we started doing this, the money structure was a little different, and I think the funny thing about our generation is it's totally reversed since we started doing it. I think you and I started doing it at about the same time, and like when we were in high school, our heroes had big Warner Brothers contracts and stuff like that, and we probably were both aware that some of them started on Fresh Sound, and we were like starting this path, you know what I mean, or whatever, that meant. And since the whole business changed, and then since more talent came in and more people, the reason to make a record changed. I think at this stage in my life, the only reason to make a record is, I think it's a combination of because I still have an impulse to create and to make something positive and put it out, even if it affects a single person. I have an impulse just to make the thing, and I have joy. My favorite thing is to write a song, put it in front of a band. I love being in the studio, and these are things I love doing, and so that's why I keep doing them. I love the process of composing because I love seeing where the idea leads. I basically love the entire process up until like mixing the record, and then hate the rest. So I think right now, like, yeah, self-expression seems so precious or something. I'm trying to be less precious about it these days and just say that, like, I make it because I have an impulse. There's an element of, like, I'm happier and more functional as a human, as a husband, as a dad, if I'm doing this thing. I'll be brutally honest, I'm not making my living off of making these records, that's for damn sure, so, but the impulse is still there. And then I do like the notion that I'm sharing something, and I'm also creating an experience. This is something I learned from playing. I used to tour with a band called the Either Orchestra back in Boston, and we toured to Ethiopia and Uganda, did a lot of big things. It was super formative experience for me. And I started thinking about how Russ, the leader of that band, Russ Gershon, this great guy, because he had an idea, he created these experiences for us. Because he had this idea to try to arrange some Ethiopian tunes, this domino effect resulted in my traveling to Ethiopia. It's a life-changing experience. And so I started thinking about that in terms of my own, if I have the impulse to create, I'm also, I had a gig with my band last Tuesday, and it was fun for all. If I do say so myself, everyone had a good time, So there has to be something positive out of that, where people came out to the gig and enjoyed it. I had a wonderful time. The people in the band, it's also about creating an experience for them. They also were paid for the night, and so, I think there's something about creating something.
It creates community, right?
It really does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also, now that I have kids, I think, it'd be easy to stop doing it and be I just got to work, just do the teaching and be, but I think there's an element of daddy follows his passions, you know what I mean? I think that's being a better example for my kids by continuing to, and I'd be doing myself and in turn them a disservice. I don't mean to put it on this huge pedestal it's so important, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there is a value to me, like you said, in connection, you know, it's community, it's creating experiences for people, which I've been the benefit of, you know, having been sideman in other projects that have meant something to me. I think that's the other thing, is contribution. I love this quote. The guy who was the editor-in-chief of Thrasher magazine, he was kind of famously this like harsh dude, a little bit of a bitter dude, didn't quite become pro, and then was like worked in the biz, and so he was a little...
Thrasher pro skater?
Skateboarder.
Okay,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. Jake Phelps, named Jake Phelps. You know, famously says what's on his mind. And he had his own demons with like never quite making it as a pro kind of thing. But one thing he said was, in listening to some like whiny kid who has a pro board out but maybe isn't making enough or is having a... He's like, bro, skateboarding doesn't owe you shit. You owe it. And so like I read that and I thought about that with any time I get a little dark jazz-wise. And I think about everything this music has given me. Because I'm from Plainville, Massachusetts. It's not that I grew up poor or anything like that. I had a wonderful childhood, you know. But I was not going to know anything about, I mean, jazz led me to like, you know, reading Kerouac and reading, you know, discovering like Buddhism and, you know, just all these things that I just, my mind, it wouldn't have gone there. You know what I mean? Like it opened my entire universe up. And then these wonderful travels that I've benefited from and these incredible people that I get to meet. And that's just by being a part of the community. There's an element of like, I owe it. It's more like, no, like contribute work for other people, contribute your take on it. You know, if I make a record, it's my own, in my own tiny little corner of the jazz world. This music has done nothing but give to me. It changed my life drastically. So I think that's kind of what it means to keep making stuff, you know?
Really... Again, wanted to thank Jeremy for all of his thoughts, and I hope you were inspired by this video as much as I am. Check out his group Plainville in the link below. Also, he has lots of other albums and projects. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope to see you next time. Bye.